The Taming of Nan by Ethel Carnie, Chapter 8. Cherry Tide. "Well, what hast thou left thy feyther doing?" asked Granny, who had been waiting for the two girls in the doorway of her shop cottage. Polly met Granny's cheery gaze for a moment or two before answering. Then she said, as she took off the hat specially manufactured to catch Adam Wilde's soul, "Oh, we left him peeling potatoes." Granny stared, looking startled for a moment. The idea of Cherry descending to the task of peeling potatoes gave her a shock similar to that a good royalist might feel on viewing a king washing his own shirt. Then, on second thoughts, she realised that this was possibly part of Cherry's diplomacy. "Nay, come in, lass," she said to Becky. So Becky came in. The clean, small kitchen, where no one could tell exactly where the kitchen ended and the shop began, changed subtly with their entry. The cuckoo clock striking made them start, then giggle. "And how is them limb narves of his?" queried Granny, returning to the topic of her son-in-law. Then she said sharply, "What art doing, Polly?" Polly blushed. She had been slyly using a face leaflet. "I think so," said Granny, as she put the thing away. "That nice enough without powder." Becky sat with downcast eyes, looking, Granny decided, as if she couldn't say peas. Granny did not care a lot for Becky. "The doctor thinks he'll have to have an operation," said Polly, patting her hair. Then she put a bunch straight. "When there's a bed empty," she added. "Oh, aye," said Granny. She looked across quite fiercely at John Bunyan, who, with his companion picture John Milton, was blissfully unconcerned. "Well," said the old Calvinist, "what is, I suppose." She commenced to make her stew in the back kitchen. Polly and Becky explored the house, the garden, and finally went out into the lanes to see what kind of flowers and lads Cherrydale grew. Incidentally, they found black snails and threw them over their shoulders for luck. Then they wandered back again. Granny gave them macaroons to fill their mouths and a love tale each to fill their minds. It was whilst Granny was yet busy filling the white-lined dishes that a step sounded on the cobbles just outside the door. "Polly," called Granny, "just serve 'em, Wilter." Polly reluctantly laid down, parted in the church porch. Her inquiring eyes stared full into the Airedale brown ones of Adam Wilde. Becky looked up from her boot, recognising him, and got behind us again. Polly was very pink. It seemed to her that her face and neck were stuck all over with kisses made visible to this young man, who was also a little embarrassed. He seemed to have forgotten what he had come in for. "Got unstuck, Polly," called Granny, breaking the awful spell. Polly's giggle said that she had. Granny came out wiping her fat dimpled hands on a snowy huckaback, and saying, "Thy feyther's reet, thou couldn't feat thy way out of a sugar bag, lass." Then a good-humoured glance saw whom the customer was. "Oh, it's you, Adam," she said. "This is my granddaughter, Adam, Miss Cherry. Now, what's to think about her?" She looked at Polly with eyes that said she was the finest lass in the universe, which was somewhat comical after the remarks she had made about her a moment ago. Adam smiled prudently. What did he think of her? He hardly knew what he thought, except that her bare neck offended his Puritan instincts. In the broad light of day, she outshone that vision that had haunted him of how she looked under the rays of his lantern, the wheat waving behind her. One portion of his brain was standing her beside Susan Thorpe and saying that she was like a half-gaudy petunia beside a daisy, and the other part was listening to Granny, asking him if it would not be better if Polly had a bit of a practice before Sunday. He nodded indefinitely. The face skin of him tingled with the memory of his trespass over the girl's face. He had the intensest desire to escape. Polly went and sat down beside, parted in the church porch. Adam ordered the tobacco old Wilde usually called in for. "Well, how is thy feyther?" asked Granny with sympathy. Adam frowned slightly. "Pulling round," he answered. He did not look over glad. "And how did that calf go on?" asked Granny. Jabez Thorpe had been telling her of the beast. "She'd got a nail driven into her underjaw," said Adam. "They found it at the slaughterhouse when her head was off." "Well, that's some luck," commented Granny. Then she said, "I'm fain thy feyther's pulling round." Adam did not second this. Despite her admiration of Cromwell's iron sincerity in theory, Granny nowadays found it somewhat harsh. Having a heart that may stop at any minute makes one look kindlier on life and people, sometimes. Granny changed the subject. She noticed a holiday look about his attire. "Going to a wedding?" she queried, with a wink. Adam pocketed the tobacco. "Nay," he said awkwardly, "only taking Miss Thorpe to the tide." Granny saw her great plan of matchmaking for once in her life shattered. It had seemed to her Adam would have sense enough for two. She'd wanted him for Polly, but all she said was, "That might do her to hang thy hot up there, Adam. Susan'll have a pot of brass when she's 21." The young man reddened. "Bob going too?" queried Granny. Failing Adam, the younger brother mightn't be a bad match. Adam had resented Granny's speech, though he said no word. Granny saw it all whilst fixing the weights that had fallen down. Truth pricked, she thought, with genial malice. Adam merely replied to the query regarding his brother going to the tide. "If he gets back," said Adam, "he's over clouds with Ted." "That's my cousin Ted, Polly," said Granny to Polly. Polly tossed them a disinterested look from behind parted in the church porch. Adam's mind was obsessed with the soft roundness of her cheeks, that peculiar indefiniteness of feature which made it look as though it had been moulded into vivacious beauty. Then had a hand laid on that blurred and made it indescribable, all save the eyes, and the round chin with its deep dimple, and the beautiful singer's throat. These stuck out in the memory. The rest could not be classified. Yes," murmured Polly politely, and retreated once more behind her story. "Good afternoon," said Adam. Becky's boot was shaking. Adam could scarcely have got out of earshot when she went off like a bottle of fizz, and Polly, after a futile attempt to withstand the desire, joined her. Their giggles worried Granny, who tried to find out why they laughed, but all they would give as the reason was that Becky had christened Adam John Willie from heaven. Granny smiled. If somebody had made a right fool of Adam Wilde, it'd be a decent body after, she said. But I doubt he's backed the wrong horse for that. Susan Thorpe would make a fool of nobody. Two wise folk wedding, there's no sense in it. And Adam's head had that big bump of self-esteem when he were only a bairn. It could have been used for that peg. With which she went back to the stew dishes. As she brought them out and set them on the table, she informed the two girls benevolently that she was going to take them to the tide. Becky turned green with disappointment. Polly's eyes filled with water. Going to the tide with an old woman? Alas! 17 looked on the world turned to dust and ashes. Out of a silence that made her ask them if they'd lost their tongues, Polly inquired casually if Adam Wilde was a rich man. All farmers in novelettes were rich. He'd be the richest man in these parts one day if he can only see for looking, was Granny's epigram. Polly interpreted it literally. 17 and 70, with a heart that docks and carries one, esteem riches differently. When Susan Thorpe came in shopping that afternoon, Polly studied her points cold-bloodedly. She was just the kind of girl Adam ought to marry. But Polly had an experience of boy lore that Susan had not. "Does she sing?" asked Polly of Granny later. When answered in the negative, Polly's spirits rose. At 7 o'clock, Granny was sold out, lock, stock and barrel, as she phrased it. It was ever thus at Cherrydale Tide. She stacked up the fire, donned her bonnet, wherein the flaming geranium stood symbolic of her democratic leanings, and brought down her goose-head umbrella. The two flappers had been dressing an hour. Polly had donned the blue muslin in very irony of soul. She had likewise let her hair down and put it in a thick plait to show that she was a baby, she had whispered to Becky. She did not look far from it either, as she said it. Granny went out to put up the shop shutters. Sunset glamour filled the one-streeted village with the stream flowing through it. Susan Thorpe was coming along. The sun-glory was on her face. It was an unusually animated look. "Have you seen Mr. Wilde about?" She asked for Adam while she was thinking of Bob. "Down there by that cherry tree," nodded Granny. Adam had been waiting 5 minutes and had finally gone out of reach of that girlish laughter from within Granny's shop. It stopped him thinking. Granny peered sideways as she put up her second shutter. She could just see the cherry bloom and Adam dark against it. Susan started back as she saw there were no other people other than this determined-looking farmer. "Where are the others?" she asked. She felt faint. "When Bob gets on moors," laughed Adam, "he forgets time. We can be walking on." Susan was not convinced. Moreover, Cherrydale would talk. She stared hesitatingly at the cherry tree. Adam argued Cherrydale gossips down. He had an idea for a moment that this was the right time to propose to Susan, and that the cherry bloom wasn't a bad setting. But he was so sure of Susan, the moment went by. His determination overbeat the gentle Susan. They went towards the tide, the many lights casting that glow in the sky, feeble rival of the sunset. If Adam Wilde had not been so determined to make himself not only marry Susan, but love her, so obstinate on self-conquest, so iron firm to save Sad Farm at any cost, and incidentally himself from Polly Cherry, thus making this girl's heart the buffer between two unwanted disasters, he would have realized that this white silence of Susan's was a very different thing from that blushing shyness of modesty, or even a fear of gossips. Absorbed in thinking out a letter that would keep off the yellow-faced man, soothe him down, with Susan trailing along by him in dumb misery, these two wholly estimable young people went towards the folly of Cherrydale tide. 4 miles of dew-drenched, dew-scented country, blackbird thrilled, and they scarcely spoke a word. And so much may a man's wish be father to the thought that Adam took this as a good augury of their being suited to each other. During this walk Bob was out ranging on the clouds, getting into alternate fits of rage and admiration, according to the behaviour of his dog. Ted, the organ blower, describing a place where rabbits asked to be caught almost, whilst ever at their heels Luke Ragg, the pedigree dog. He breathed hard, but manfully walking on his wrists, as Polly termed his forepaws. Moreover, he wore the leggings. His eyes shone doggy love of Bob. His tongue loppled out redly. He imitated the antics of the dog who was ranging, quite unmoved by the laughter of Bob and Ted at the sight. After a hard run of 15 minutes, Bob's lurcher caught a baby hare. Ragg seized it and ate it, skin and all, in a space of time short of miraculous. Then, the untrimmed him satiated for a time, Bob looked back over the way they had come. The clouds. The moor merited its name at this hour. He saw the light in the sky and gasped suddenly, with the horror of a pleasure-seeker who had almost forgotten a treat in store. "Cherrydale tide! Let's hop it, Ted!" They hopped it, Ted keeping his eyes skinned for the gamekeeper, all about them the darkness of the moors, that cloudy soberness, save where the moor-pools filled with the gold of sunset, and the vapours of the sky leaned a rosy cheek against the dark earth. The curlew's on-the-wing cry seemed to float out of infinity. Bob was utterly, gloriously happy, with a happiness Adam's struggle could not invade, nor his father's weak folly, nor Sarah's worriting lest he be caught poaching, whilst even at that moment there was fluttering to the tide a petticoat destined to invade the peace of that debonair mind. Never again, it was written, should his eyes look on the clouds with quite the same free anchorite's feelings roused in mind and heart. Henceforth the moor would speak to him with a new note that was after all only the echo from his own soul. Ted went to Sag Farm whilst Bob dressed up for the fair, if pulling off a silk muffler, putting on a front and tie can be described as dressing. Old Wild was laid in the saddle. Sarah had just come in from putting the hens up. She had an old overcoat of Adam's on. Sarah always made Ted feel sorry. Femininity had died in Sarah, under that task of working to save Sag Farm at Adam's relentless pace. She looked so like a man that it was not wonderful that Adam forgot she was a woman. She walked like a cow. She went nowhere beyond the farm and its fields, unless it was on a sticking expedition after a windy night. She rarely spoke, unless spoken to, about work. She was that tragic thing, a farm drudge, doing two people's tasks, and in addition, responsive to Adam's care, Bob's moods, her father's weaknesses. She was a woman under these masculine things she wore, troubled about many things, and, as all the village said, faced with the workhouse if ever Adam married and his wife did not take to her. "Going to the tide, Sarah?" queried Ted, with that awe of her on him. Sarah laughed. It was tired laughter, untinged, however, by bitterness. "I think," she said, "I've got past that sort of thing." Ted counted her up on his fingers. She was 28, just a year older than himself. She looked 50. Ted went out thoughtful, as he always felt after a visit to Sag Farm. "Couldn't your Adam find a farm with less work and better pasturings to it?" he queried. "Lots," said Bob. "Then why?" "Adam'll stop by Sag Farm till it drops on top of him," asserted Bob glumly. He met Ted's eye. "Because," he answered, "it's Sag Farm, and he's named after the first chap took it on. It's a fancy. The iller it does, the closer he sticks to it, like some fools of women stick by ill husbands." They went down the glimmering hillside, over the wishing bridge, along the road, through the now deserted village. At the end of their second mile, they came upon Granny and her charges. Granny was winded. She sat under a hedge. The girls had bidden her rest, but were thinking unutterable things. "Why, it's my cousin Polly," ejaculated Ted, whereupon Granny got up, took his arm, and left Bob to Polly and Becky. They walked one on each side of him, according to town etiquette. Ted pitied the shunner of petticoats going gawkily along between the two girls. A queer Bob this, compared with that one who sang Drake's drum, roaring it out above the blowing of the moorwind, to the accompaniment of the whitened rushes, the shaggy bents, the whir of moorfowl's wings. He was still mum at the end of the third mile, whereupon Polly made some remark Ted could not overhear, but he saw Bob look at her with less of instinctive distrust of petticoats. Bob began to talk dogs to her, a distinctive mark of favour, and Ted set his fair cousin down as being as fause as a rat, nay, fause as the fousest rat that had ever hold. But all Polly's fouseness was only softly smiling interest, and the upward glance that, when properly accomplished, makes the mere male realise himself as a very wonderful being. When they reached the first street lamp, and Bob saw the face of this girl, to whom for half a mile he had been talking worms and areca, he collapsed mentally. His ear tips grew scarlet. They went on towards that pandemonium of sound made by 6 roundabouts playing 6 different tunes, interjected by sirens, shrieking, drums beating, roaring of lions, and above all this the laughter and talk of half the people from half a score villages round, and an exodus from narrow fields. It was the tide. Into it, trembling for her bunion and her purse, they piloted Granny Harker. Cherry had asked her by note of hand by Polly to keep her eye on the girls. She wondered what that Narrowfields doctor would think of her living a quiet life, if she wished to live, as she struggled in that tide of laughing, joking, swearing, horse-playing, merry human beings who had temporarily turned into irresponsible children. Cowle youths tickled Granny under the chin with ticklers on wire and asked her if she brought her goloshes. Red-faced men with hoarse voices hawked the ticklers. A fat man staring about him in bewilderment as to how he should get out of the tide now he had got into it, trod on Granny's bunion, and she asked him to look where he was going, to the laughter of all about them. It was at this moment that a young man touched Polly on the elbow. "Oh, hello, Peter," she said nonchalantly. Peter attached himself to the party. It was the tide where more and the merrier his watchword, but Bob looked suspiciously at him nevertheless. Bob made the bell ring every time in the shooting gallery. Bob hitting pasteboard rabbits that hopped aggravatingly slow, then flew aggravatingly fast as the shot went. Bob winning a cake stand for Granny in the deceitful tub-throwing game, and paying 3 times as much to get it as it was worth. Bob trying to resist the call of the girl in the green blouse, "Once through the mouth and you get your money back," became a figure round which the gaping crowd gathered. He was so light-heartedly earnest at a fair. It became a matter of life and death to him that he knocked down the pipes in the grinning, open-mouthed cardboard face. Yet he was laughing all the time, whilst into his pocket ever went his hand, and he had quite forgotten that he was spending part of the egg money belonging to Sag Farm. But when he brought out Punch and was patted on the back by the old chap with the machine that registered the force behind a man's hammer blow, when the old man said, "My lad, that's the first time Punch has come out this tide," Polly hung on to Bob's arm to let the admiring young women standing around know that this muscular fellow was a great friend of hers. Whereupon the young women measured Polly and looked at each other as much as to say they wondered what he could see in her. But then, when they got into the lion show, and the beery-looking man with the imitation tiger skin over his shoulder, standing on a stool and looking over the heads of the crowd, made his sublime speech before going into the lions, Polly let go of Bob's arm, and Bob felt lost, abandoned, the sun gone out. It was in vain that he told Polly all this was flapdoodle, that this speech was made every time that the lions were as harmless as cats brought up in a Dolly Varden hat. Think of the courage, patience, perseverance which it has required to subdue these noble creatures of the jungle, wound up the beery-faced man. Granny didn't think they ought to be allowed to go into lions' dens, though, true to tell, she would have been very disappointed had anyone stopped Lorenzo from going in. Polly closed her eyes and said she dared not look, but could not help opening them as Lorenzo worked up the lion, whilst Bob wondered that an old woman so plain as Granny could have a granddaughter so beautiful. "He's to do that to make 'em look wild," he assured Polly. "Tame as shrew mice." Whiz, bang! Lorenzo just got out as the lion's paw came crashing against the door. "I wonder what we should do if one got out," grinned Ted. "Rummy tide it'd be," which made Polly turn pale and Bob assure her that lions never did get out of cages. Peter, left to talk to Becky and Ted, caught Polly's eye once. She grew quiet under it. Peter was putting in a claim. As for Granny, she'd summed Peter up as a young man who wore gold hoops on his fingers. Never in Granny's long life had she known any young man who wore gold hoops on his fingers do any young woman any good. They left the lion show just in time for the circus. It was a struggle to get up the steps through that crowd. "I wonder how much a week he gets for making a fool of himself," quoth Granny of the clown. The lady in the blue tights and spangles began to beat a drum then, and drowned everything. Bob paid for the party, more egg money. They stumbled down into the circus, smelling of sawdust and paraffin torches, horses and guinea pigs. Polly sat on a long box next to a red-faced man, who looked half seas over, according to Granny, who liked to talk as if she'd been in the mercantile marine. Once Polly wondered what there was in the box. Guinea pigs, no doubt, said Bob, and sat down on the other side of her. It was a true old-time circus. First came the lady in the blue tights, leaping on the white pony's back, waving a ribbon, cheered by the crowd, the villain with the rose cracking his whip to make it throw her, which made Granny wish it would kick him. Then came the boy in ruby velvet, whom Granny liked to believe was the son of the lady in the tights, as he would be a bit of comfort to a poor thing, having to jump about like that for a living. The young man in the ruby velvet said he would place on his forehead, his knees, his throat, his feet, a glass of wine, without touching it with his hands, and afterwards drink it, which he eventually did, really very clever. Though one astute countrywoman said it was amazing he was not drunk, seeing he was doing this all day, if it was wine. "Oh, Becky," murmured Polly, as he rose with a great and noble air. The youth in the ruby velvet made a collection for himself, which was vaguely explained by the villain with the rose, but nobody minded. Was it not the tide? Polly was in such a flutter when he came to her that she gave him half-a-crown instead of a penny, but even that was forgotten, as the thinking pony, shining like brown satin, trimmed with pink paper roses, and looking exceedingly knowing, was led into the ring. It is quite true that the pony told the time of day. He also told the time it was by a gentleman's watch that was a quarter slow. His white foot struck the minutes, and the villain with the rose told him to, and then the hour. "Well, if ever I saw," laughed Granny, leaning forwards and giving a bald-headed man in front of her a crack on the head with her cake stand, whereupon the bald-headed man's wife made remarks about some people having been brought up in a wood, whereupon Granny gently rubbed the bald-headed man's head and said folks with soft heads shouldn't come to the tide, and there might have been a free fight ensue but for the pony coming round at this moment. "Find me the gentleman who would rather drink a pint of beer than go to church," said the villain with the rose darkly. There was then great consternation amongst the young men who were total abstainers, lest the pony made a mistake, and their sweethearts believed the pony. Grins and complacency amongst the men who valued a pint of beer and didn't mind being selected. Round and round in a great hush went the pony. He stopped once before a young man with a white face and eyeglasses. Protest from the young man with the glasses. Hysterical giggles from the women round him. Then the pony went on, and the young man breathed again. But at last the pony stopped. He stopped in front of the red-faced man, seated beside Polly. "Is it the gentleman on the back row?" said the villain. Pony shook his head decidedly. "Is it the gentleman sitting on the box?" quoth he. Pony ponders gravely, then nods fiercely 3 times. "That's right," guffawed the man next to Polly Cherry. "Well, if ever I," laughed Granny again, but managed to keep the cake stand off the bald-headed man this time. How the pony selected Polly as the young lady who was deeply in love, to her indignation, need not take long to tell. How the party went out, after discovering that Polly had been sitting on a box of serpents, on which she would sit down no more, though the serpents were then round the neck of the villain, and how Bob went into a show that had nothing to show but a freak pig and 2 distorting mirrors, also need not take long, though by telling the crowd outside what a rare show it was, and getting them in to take others in as a Cherrydale tide joke, set the drunken showman on his feet again. Whilst the noise grew louder, lights burnt brighter, more and more people surged up, and the young folk went on the switchbacks, flip-flaps, or rocking horses, in the swing boats. Only Granny would not have a packet, as she said. Folk were put together so queerly. But after they had topsy-turvied, she went in with them to see the lady with the leopard spots, who apologised for not being able to show further than the waist. How Polly got into a peep show, after great argument, with the snowman, who said she had her hair down, and they might be prosecuted, until Polly solved the problem by pushing her hair under her hat, remains to be told, And how she said to Bob after they came out, all that fuss just to look at people pulling their stockings up, which made Bob laugh and realise a soul of exquisite innocence, cunning as she thought herself. But Granny had not liked the demeanour of Peter in the show of the leopard-spotted lady. Granny began to speak of going home. Her heart was dotting and carrying one. Her bunion had been jumped on 4 times, and she had begun to realise tides were not good places to which to bring bunions. They reached the Mayflower, that big boat that was visible all over the tide, going up and down, with its shrieking load of girls taken in by lads who mocked their shrieks and, true to tell, got them in so that they had a good excuse for putting their arms around their waists. "Going up here?" asked Bob. "Polly, it'll topple thee out," said Granny. But Polly went, when the boat stopped, up the shaky scaffold-like steps, Bob holding her safely, the others coming behind. Into the Mayflower these pilgrim souls of youth stepped, adventuring as those graver souls of long ago adventured. Up the steps still they came, whilst a couple of grinning, beefy-faced giants, waiting to pull the ropes thick as polonies, called in stentorian voices, "This way for sailing." Peter sat in the stern with Ted. Bob, Becky and Polly were at the bow. The middle of the boat soon filled. There was only room for 2 at the bow. Polly was just quivering, thinking they were moving, when Becky whispered, "Oh, John Willie from heaven." Adam Wilde gravely piloted Susan Thorpe towards the only seat. He found himself between her and a girl in blue muslin, and a large hat that touched his face. "Why, Addie," called Bob in surprise. Adam at the tide with Susan Thorpe was an earthquake to Bob. Susan Thorpe's eyes were like bits of dark velvet in a tired white face. "Sit down," yelled the rope pullers from below. "No standing up." Much pulling by the 2 panting men below. Then the Mayflower began to go, got her soul into her. The fun commenced. Polly's was the first shriek that rang out. At the sound of it, Adam recognised the girl in blue muslin. A shriek like that in a murder scene would have made an actress her fortune. "Hold fast to the irons," he told Susan Thorpe. She linked her arms around the protecting rails behind her. The occupants of the boat saw the tide become a multicoloured mass of swimming lights. A chorus of shrieks rang out now as she went up and down to the catcalls of young men, the mimicry of those rope pullers below, whom the girls thought were now taking a personal spite in sending her higher yet higher. Polly's laughter, Polly's shrieks rose above the others. Paler and paler went Susan Thorpe as she clung to the unsympathetic irons. Cherrydale tide was almost upside down now. People standing below said it shouldn't be allowed. The great irons that poised the boat creaked. Those in the bow looked down on those in the stern. Those in the stern then looked down in the bow. "Oh!" cried Polly Cherry, growing too terrified to shriek, yet still enjoying it in a terror of delight, going to perdition yet. Then down she came, down, down, into the uttermost gulfs, and Polly had seized blindly onto the arm of Adam Wilde, her face buried in his coat, to shut out the awful sight of the tide below them. Her muslin sleeves flapped against his face. He sat stiffly upright, so as not to have the touch of her hair in his eyes, whilst the sirens of beauty and of song called to him, as they have called to man from immemorial ages. On the other side of him, industry, modesty, wisdom clung more tightly to the rails, her face twisted into a brave smile, her lips twitching, and Peter, looking down on Polly from his end of the boat, saw a flushed face lift itself from Adam's chest, recognised the farmer as lights from a roundabout streamed momentarily over his face. Giddily they came down to where Granny was waiting. There was a great introduction. "Safe on terracotta," laughed Granny. "By, anybody as goes in there ought to be insured." Then they set out back to Cherrydale. Adam and Bob, Ted, Polly, Becky, Susan and Granny, all but Peter, who was training it home. Through the silver splendour of the spring night they walked back to Cherrydale, the blare of bronze roundabouts, trumpets fading away under the cold, tiny voices of brooks whispering of grasses, silences singing between, save when they spoke of all they had seen. "Aye, it's a bonny night, one more and one less," said Granny meditatively. "It'll be too late for Polly to practise," she said later, but Adam said it wasn't too late for him. Susan Thorpe would not go up to Sag Farm. Adam took her to her own farm gate. Bob, Becky and Polly were gone up to Sag Farm. "Enjoyed thyself, Susan?" asked Jabez as she sat down. She'd been rubbing her cheeks with her hands all the way across the fields to give them colour before going in for her parents' inspection. "First rate," she said briskly, "but I'm tired. I'll go to bed." She fled before that colour, brought by the rubbing of her hands, had faded, whilst round the yellow-keyed harmonium in Sag Farm kitchen a quartet of young voices rolled the Hallelujah chorus down into the silence of the night. Then Polly sang her pieces for the morrow, and as she sang she became again the tender priestess of song, joyful song, untouched by the sordidness of the drab kitchen at Narrowfields, caring nothing for lads, scent bottles and cheap trinkets. She was youth, singing with its voice turned towards the sun, but even so had sung all the Arkers but one, whether they sang in choirs or pubs, whilst the organist's heart followed that fresh voice as a bird follows the fowler's cry. Youth and song and beauty, a trinity of gifts, surely, but not gifts that would make her a helpmeet for a poor farmer. Rag went delirious on Polly meeting him again by light of a lantern upheld by Bob near the kennel. Polly was touched too, but giggled at sight of the leggings Rag slept in. Adam let Bob take the girls to Granny's cottage. After Bob's return, Adam found one of her white gloves, violet perfumed. He kept it until he saw her make eyes at the tenor and the bass at the charity next day. Then, as Bob said he was going down that way, he asked him to call at Granny's and give it to her, one of the girls having left it. Bob accepted the ambassadorship, but when Granny asked Adam later if they'd seen aught of a white glove at Sag Farm, as Polly had lost one, he prudently said no. Bob had kept it. The siren had left it as her challenge. Bob had taken it up. Polly went back to Narrowfields in high spirits, satisfied with her work. Adam and Bob had words about the egg money. Susan Thorpe was sent by her mother to get a recipe from Sarah. Sarah was gathering eggs. Adam was gone for provender to town. Bob asked Susan the best way to catch a girl, confessing that he knew more about rabbits. She looked so demure, such a little Quakeress, that Bob said, "Give me some tips." She smiled, and he thought she looked somewhat delicate in the morning light. Before she left, she was well on the way to being his mother confessor. He was to tell her the progress he made, and she would advise tactics. When Adam came back from town, Bob was working industriously at a fence, capless, singing gaily. "Oh, take when you can the word of a man, but in love the advice of a lady. Fal-de-la, fal-de-la, in love the advice of a lady."